Good morning, listeners. Thank you for tuning in. Before we get started, please be sure to hit the like button on this video, the notification bell so that you know when I upload new videos. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. It does let YouTube know that I'm here. And without further ado, we're going to continue on in the Confessions of a Video Vixen with Chapter 15, I Choose Life. By February 2002, I had gotten used to living in and out of hotel rooms. I was in survival mode, but wasn't necessarily living. I had gone back to being an exotic dancer, hating every minute of it. But I had a little boy dependent on me. However, out of the mud came a rose, and I slowly but surely started to dig my way out of that life. While in my hotel room, just a few days after returning from Miami, I began rummaging through my belongings where I came across a shoebox that I had taped shut. In the box, I had stored a lot of my memories, backstage passes, pictures, airline tickets, and the like. I opened the box and began shifting through this archive of my life and instantly began to cry. Here I was in this tiny room with all of my belongings stored in my car and my entire life stuffed into a shoebox. Everyone I knew, everywhere I had been, it was all there, and none of it was worth anything anymore. None of it had gotten me any further in life. If anything, I had regressed and became less of a person than I was ever meant to be. I thought about how it all began in those first few months in Los Angeles, how all my life I had been running from one form of abuse to another, and how now I was the one abusing myself. Sitting on the floor, I cried, and it pained me so terribly that I rose to my knees and began to pray. I could barely get the words out for the sobbing, but I knew that He would hear me. I admitted things to myself that I had never confessed to before and asked God to forgive me and help me get my life back. I begged Him to show me the way and assured Him that I was ready now to listen and to follow. I cried and prayed for 45 minutes, and by the end of the prayer, I was so weak and motionless. I needed help, and the only one who could help me was Him. Within 3 days of my first real plea to God, I met two people who would change my life. I met an attorney at the club and began having dinner with him on the weekends. He was maybe 70 years old, and all he wanted was long dinners at his favorite Japanese restaurant. At the end of every meal, he would hand me an envelope filled with $2,500 in cash every Saturday. It was the same deal. He told me there was another plan for me and that I was too special to be dancing at the club. This money allowed me to stay out of the club and pursue other interests, such as developing my auditioning and writing abilities. To me, he was an angel on earth. Around this time, I also met a man named Mario. Although I wasn't romantically interested in him, he pursued me intently, and in the process, he became someone I trusted. I was too embarrassed to tell him I was living at a hotel, but when I finally broke down and told him, he allowed me to stay at his apartment. He said he would be moving out of his apartment in a week. It would be vacant and still under lease to him for another month. I was relieved to be out of the hotel and saving the $500 a week that it took to stay there. So now I was making more money and hardly spending any of it. It was within this period that tax time came around, and I received $3,000 tax refund check from my work on a man apart. A month later, it was time to leave Mario's apartment and find a home of my own. I had the money, but I had two very serious problems. My credit was ruined, and I had never had a legitimate job in my life. When I was married to G, everything had been in my name. When he decided to leave, he also left me with all the household bills. On the credit scale of 500 to 850, I fell below the radar with a credit score of 416. With all the money in the world, no one was going to accept me as a tenant. It seemed that I would never get out of the mess I was in. I continued to pray and to hold on to faith because I had nothing else. I was on my way to see a friend one day on the promise that he would co-sign on a place for me. I was desperate and willing to try anything. On my way to his apartment, I got off the main road and began to take the back streets. I did this out of habit and was, in fact, on the same back road I had parked on when I had to sleep in my car. Right there was a big, bright banner which read, "Apartment for rent," with a phone number listed. I fumbled for my phone and began to dial. As the phone rang, I began to think back to those cold nights I spent on the street looking into the windows of other people's homes with envy. There was no rational reason why this building's manager should give me a different answer than the others I had applied to, but I felt positive nonetheless. The phone continued to ring as I drove past the building, and then an answer. With a bit of charm, I set an appointment within the hour. Sorry, I done talked my throat dry and I ain't got nothing up here today. My nerves were bad and I began to shake. I felt like this could be my last chance. Mario's lease was about to expire and I didn't want to waste any more money on hotels. This had to work. It just had to. An hour later, a friend accompanied me to view the apartment. It was beautiful, spacious, and perfect. 2 bedrooms, 2 baths, a fireplace, everything I needed within 1,200 square feet. I needed to give my son a sense of security and a feeling of having a place to belong. He had never complained or asked questions. I knew that his little mind, as long as he was with me, he felt safe. As long as I wore a smile, he could be happy. But I also knew that it was time that I put my baby first, and this is where I would start. My credit history shocked the manager. There were 34 items listed, all 34 were negative. He gave me the look. I began to panic and basically pleaded for my life. I began rambling on about my separation from G and how it kept me from renting a place and about being evicted. I told him how I had been sleeping in and out of my car for 9 months with my son and that I had $10,000 cash and would give him whatever he needed to make him feel safe about letting me rent from him. I went on and on until the tears began to fall. The look he had given me a few minutes earlier softened. After a few days of phone calls, phone tag, prayers, and more prayers, I got the call, and a day later I moved in. It was February 21st, 2002. God was working with me, and now it was time to handle business. I paid the rent for the next 6 months and continued planning the next phase of my life. I was determined to do better, to reflect on my life, pinpoint my mistakes, and make them worth the pain. I would start by no longer being identified as Yzette Santiago because Yzette wasn't real. Yzette thought she was invisible. But her behavior led to immense self-destruction and not only tore apart her life, but the life of the little boy who depended on her. It was time for me to stop being afraid of myself, and I welcome back Corinne Steffens. There had been so much growth and discovery in my life since I had convulsed on the bathroom floor of Mr. Chow, since I drove aimlessly around Los Angeles with no place to live. I was grateful and blessed. There are so many things that the average person takes for granted. These were the very things that I had taken for granted too in the past. I would never take those things for granted again. There were days in the car when I drove around for hours with my sons strapped in the back seat. There were no rest stops on those days, nowhere to wash up or use the bathroom. We didn't have the luxury of television or video games. We didn't have the necessities like food or water. The amazing part of it all was that God had always allowed me to see people who were worse than I was. I would be in the drive-thru at some fast food place feeling like less of a person because all I had left was $1. And with the $1, I was about to buy my son a 99-cent chicken sandwich. As I dug the nickels and dimes out of my pocket, there before me was a homeless man or a woman. This happened more than a few times, and I began to heed the message. I had a car, and there were clothes shoved into the trunk. I had 99 cents, and on many days I had a hotel room I was able to pay for. I appeared to be a queen, and others less fortunate, although I was a pauper to myself. With my near drug overdose in the past and memories of Miami still fresh enough to sustain me, I tried to put the celebrity lifestyle behind me and focus on my new life. I stopped hanging out, going to clubs, meeting my old friends and lovers. But as I sat in my new place with all my ducks in a row, I was revisited by the same old loneliness and realized I had an addictive personality. I became depressed and cried every day through the spring and summer of 2002. I drank heavily and began taking painkillers to ease the pain of my loneliness. I wrote in my journal to try to maintain some sort of sanity. I wanted someone to help me, but there was no one left. While my son was asleep in his room at night, I would lock myself in the bathroom. That's where I kept my tools of destruction: a bottle of Jack Daniels, a knife, cigarettes, and prescription vial of 500 milligrams hydrocodone pills. I lay on the bathroom floor, crying, drinking with large, rapid swallows. As the liquor burned my esophagus, I began to cut into my flesh, carving onto my skin the words and names and phrases and people that were swirling in my thoughts. The slicing was so painful, I knew I had to take another dose of the powerful painkillers. The room began to spin, and I sat back for a moment, leaning against the tub, watching the stream of blood spilling onto the floor. It didn't scare me. If anything, I delighted in the sight. The blood represented the pain leaving my body. I loved the feeling. Ironically, it seemed to make me feel alive again, knowing some of the pain was escaping my raging flesh. I turned 24 in August 2002, the same day the Soul Train Lady of Soul Awards were in Los Angeles. Consequently, a lot of artists were in town. While walking around with a friend, we ran into Ja. I told him it was my birthday, and he invited us to meet him at his house for a little get-together to celebrate the occasion. I was game. Before going to Ja's house, we drove to Orange County, about 2 hours south of Los Angeles, for a summer series concert where Ja was performing. I felt happy to be there. Ja always had a way of making you feel as if everything was going to be okay. I sat on stage with his crew as he performed, beaming with pride. It was clear how far he'd come from when we first met, when he was just beginning his career. Not many people knew who he was then, and if they did, they didn't give him much respect. For a while, we couldn't even get into the clubs around town without paying the bouncer hundreds of dollars, and even then, we sometimes couldn't gain entry. But now, this was his stage, and all his fans reveled in his star power performance. For the moment, it was 2000 all over again, and I was caught up in it. Later on that night, we all went to a local sports bar and had taken up 4 or 5 tables, ordering about 3 bottles of Cristal champagne. We drank and laughed, talked and reminisced. It felt good to be with Ja again, to see people falling all over themselves to say hello. That was the high. It was like I was good enough and worthy enough to be with someone so adored. Yet another lie. I was fighting with myself, stuck between my past and my future, and frankly, on this night, my past won hands down. The party continued back at his house, and soon Jai and I were in his room behind locked doors. We were drunk by this time and had slipped back into our comfortable old ways. It was like putting on my favorite robe and house slippers. I knew this man. We talked about everything, his life, his career. This was around the time when 50 Cent debuted, and there was still unfinished beef between them. I was taken back to the day in 2000 when Ja called from New York and said he was in trouble. Later that night, he flew into Los Angeles and stayed for almost a year while recording his album Rule 336. We hung out all night, and Ja told me what the trouble had been. He and Murder Inc. had somehow become involved in an altercation with 50 Cent in a New York studio, and now, 2 years later, 50 Cent was gaining weight in the industry and speaking out against Ja. As we talked about it, I could see the concern on his face. I tried to be supportive, but deep down I knew Ja's reign would come to an end, as it does with most artists, and 50 would be the successor for the moment. Just then, as she had done a couple of years before, Ja's wife called. I sat on the edge of the bed, sipping champagne, listening to them argue. She was in New York and pregnant again with his third child. It was history repeating itself. The only difference was that this time the gripe wasn't about me. The gripe wasn't about me, but about Ashanti, Murders Inc.'s first lady. Ja's wife was positive that Ja was sleeping with Ashanti, though he denied it. Even I knew that wasn't true. The distraction with Ja was just that, a distraction, and put me in a kind of a social limbo. I knew that I had to work on changing my ways, and that change could only come with help, with my continued prayer and discipline. Sorry, y'all. I still needed help and would be for the rest of my life. Under construction. Still, even I teetered between worlds. I welcomed my mistakes because from them would come my salvation. I tried to share the lessons I was learning with a friend, Merlin Santana, whom I befriended in April 2000, not long after I first arrived in Los Angeles. I had first seen Merlin as a child actor when he appeared on The Cosby Show, and at this time, he was cast on The Steve Harvey Show playing the hunky high school heartthrob, Romeo. When we met, we were instantly attracted to each other, and over the next 2 years would maintain a relationship which would be more off than on. In October 2002, I received a phone call from Chuck. He heard that Merlin was looking for me, which was strange since I had not been in touch with him for almost a year. I was curious and needed to know why the frantic rush to find me. Hours later, Merlin called. We caught up on the latest events of each other's life and vowed to keep in touch. In the back of my mind, though I still didn't understand, it just seemed odd to me that after all this time, he would start this chain of events to find me. There was something bigger in motion, but I didn't know what. More conversations between us followed, and soon he came to visit me at my house. The first visit was late, around 2 in the morning. I had just left a party given by Wesley Snipes at his house in Venice Beach. Merlin called as he was leaving a club. I could hear in his voice that something was wrong and I wanted to help. I knew him and his habit of roaming the streets at all hours of the night and early morning. I wanted him to come visit me and let me know what was going on with him, with the hope of keeping him off the streets, if only for one night. After I arrived home, he called me from his truck. I told him the code to buzz himself into the security gate. After 2 minutes, he still hadn't buzzed. After I called to see where he was, we both realized that he was at the wrong building. He seemed disoriented, so I stayed on the phone and reeled him in. When he reached my front door, he looked awful. He was wearing a filthy white t-shirt that was ripped and blue sweatpants that were washed out and appeared dirty. His face was oily and also seemed as though he hadn't been washed in days. This wasn't the conceited, meticulous Merlin who I had once known. For the next 3 hours, we sat on the sofa and talked. The things he said were shocking, and I realized just how lost he was. Merlin took me back to his abusive childhood, things he had never shared with anyone. I cried with him because I knew his pain. He told me he hadn't been feeling worthy since the Steve Harvey show had been canceled. He thought the cancellation of the show was why he wasn't being respected by people and at the local clubs, which no longer allowed him entry. I saw a lot of him in me, the longing to be accepted and justified, the pain of early childhood abuse, the sense of emptiness within him. Merlin would ride around all night looking for places to go, places to belong. He also reminded me of the person I was trying not to be. I began to tell him about the transformations I had made and how I felt that God was working on me every day to make me a better person. I said, find your nucleus and get on your knees and pray. Stay out of the streets and recognize the messages that are being sent to you. He said, I don't know how to pray. I continued, you have to realize that not getting into the clubs wasn't a personal attack on your manhood, but a message from God to just go home. Roaming the streets will kill you if you can't humble yourself and ask God to show you what to do. All you have to do is ask. With tears in his eyes, he told me, if you and I were together again, I would have a reason to stay home. You could change me if you would just give me another chance. His words sounded sincere, and I knew better. I told him of all the things I had learned thus far, but that I had a long way to go. Merlin looked me square in the eye and told me he couldn't do those things, that he didn't know how. It hurt to hear him accept defeat before trying. With that, he was ready to leave. It was 5 a.m, and he left to roam the streets again. It would be the last time I saw Merlin. It wouldn't be the last time I saw Merlin. The following week he came back, but this time his visit frightened me. It seemed as if those first few seconds we were together passed in slow motion. I answered my door to see him clothed in black. Anyone else, this would have been nothing, but for some reason the color was symbolic of his life. He was living in a shroud of darkness. Merlin had forgotten his blue and white pinstriped Yankees hat during his last visit and came to retrieve it. We lay on my bed that night and talked for some more. He assumed I didn't want to be with him because his show was canceled. You'll want me when I'm back on, and I'll come back for you. We kissed that night, and as we had done his initial visit, and it felt wrong. I told him that nothing sexual would happen, but I would stay with him. I would like for him to stay. He was hungry, and I was prepared to feed him and maybe watch a movie. Anything would have been better than letting him go back into the streets again, but Merlin refused to stay. And at 5:45 in the morning, he left my place. He was disoriented, not even able to find his way out of the bedroom door. I begged him to stay with me for the night, but only sex would keep him with me, something I couldn't give him. My life was changing, and I knew in my heart that I was telling him was right and true. God had gotten to me, and I was here to give it to him. Merlin just couldn't receive it. I cried as he left. 5 days later, on November the 9th, 2002, Merlin was shot dead in the early morning hours while sitting in a car. I would never be the same. Thank you for listening. I apologize about the few stumbles, but it is what it is. We can't all be perfect. And this is not, I don't edit these videos. I just kind of read them. But I hope you enjoy listening. Do tell me, are you enjoying the content? And of all the people, if you've listened this far, then tell me, is there anybody that has surprised you that ended up in this book?